The dawn came quietly one morning, nearly 60 years ago, with a cool stillness to an isolated hilltop outside the city of Osan, Korea. The arid landscape stretched out below like an empty stage, waiting for the props and actors to arrive. The heavy air seemed to hint at the heat and chaos to come. The only audience was a small band of U.S. soldiers, alone, poorly armed, and with no promise of relief. 400 men of the 1st Battalion, 21st Infantry, 8th Army, had been sent from guard duty in Japan by General MacArthur to face 10,000 North Korean soldiers bent on the destruction of Osan. As we gather to commemorate the 60th anniversary of the Korean War, we are reminded by current events that the defense of Korea's freedom never sleeps. The people here old enough to remember that long ago conflict far away are fading away with each passing year. It is up to the generations that grew up with the legacy of the war to remember those that sacrificed on those days. The uneasy peace of the Korean Peninsula was broken on a hot June 25th in 1950. The North Korean army had been building up for months, preparing for the invasion that would unite the peninsula under a brutal communist dictator. South Korea was unprepared. Its army was outnumbered 10-1, and the Americans were far away in occupied Japan. That morning of the invasion, Secretary of State Dean Acheson cabled President Truman, and he began the message with, "Mr. President, I have some very serious news." Truman acted quickly to order the nearest U.S. units to mobilize and deploy to Korea at once. That order found its way down the chain of command to Lieutenant Colonel Charles Smith, 1st Battalion Commander. Smith and his 400 arrived in Osan a few days later to set up an outpost on 2 hills overlooking the main road into town. Everyone around them was running south in confusion toward the southernmost city of Pusan. Smith dug in, looked north, and waited. His men had only 100 rounds each and 2 days' rations. The rest of the division was still 1,000 miles away, and any help from America weeks away by ship. The next day, lookouts spotted the thick smoke and dust of the North Korean juggernaut as it rolled down the valley towards them. I wish we could say Colonel Smith had prevailed that day, 60 years ago, and defeated the advancing enemy against overwhelming odds. But we cannot. Smith and his 400 fought with old bazooka rounds from the last war that did not explode, artillery shells that bounced off the newest Soviet tanks, and only 1 in 10 of his men had any combat experience. The best they could hope for was to delay the enemy long enough for the rest of the division to land in the south. Like the Spartans at Thermopylae, the mission was doomed before it began. But they went. They waited, and they fought because there was no one else. Colonel Smith and his men were beaten badly, but they managed to delay the enemy for 7 hours. Those were precious hours for U.S. and UN troops pouring into Pusan to establish the defenses around the city. In those hours, tens of thousands of civilians, all refugees, escaping the atrocities inflicted on those being captured. That seemingly insignificant delay was purchased at a terrible cost. 1/3 of Smith's men were killed, captured, or wounded. Some of the captured executed by their North Korean captors. In the first days, the UN forces were given a slim chance to survive, but the men of the 1st Battalion had given them time. 2 months after halting the North's advance at the gates of Pusan, U.S. and UN forces counterattacked, liberating Osan and the capital of Seoul. We look now on a different scene. Today, Osan is a vibrant South Korean town, modern, secure, affluent by any measure, and free. Looking to the north, its citizens live in fear of starvation, imprisonment, torture, and constant repression. There is a beautiful memorial to Colonel Smith and his men on the site where they mounted a hopeless defense. It's no longer a lonely, desolate stretch of road. in a remote corner of the world, but now a beautiful park bustling with families, tourists, and commerce. There is no movie that depicts this heroic event, no parade in any main street of America to mark the anniversary, but there ought to be. Their greatest memorial is the successful, peaceful, free nation of South Korea. This is the legacy and the dream for which they fought and died. We must remember this dream in our present time. It is no less dangerous now, a world, than it was in 1950. There are still men and women sitting on lonely hilltops, overlooking barren landscapes in forgotten corners of the world, waiting, watching for what they hope will never come. At a remote Army air base in Afghanistan last week, I witnessed a moving ceremony. An honor guard assembled in formation beneath the distant snow-covered mountains and silently brought a single casket out of a truck. All activity on the huge airfield stopped as 8 soldiers solemnly carried their flag-draped friend across the empty tarmac into a waiting transport plane for the last trip home. I wondered to myself who he was, what his story could be, but it really didn't matter. He came because his country asked him to. He waited until history needed his sacrifice, and he fought to make this desolate, far-off country a better place. I hope years from now there is peace where he fell. I hope intelligent, successful people in this future place remember his sacrifice, as Koreans now remember the 400 at Osan. I hope the place where he fell becomes a thriving park filled with happy children and dedicated to those that made their freedom possible.